Welcome to the Stranded Technologies podcast, where we explore how to accelerate the future. Imagine a world of abundance, longer lives, clean energy, transparent markets, robots and AI doing the toiling labor. Why don't we have those things yet? Join us as we explore the biggest problem that holds back frontier tech: over-regulation. Now we have real solutions: startup cities, network states, and on-chain finance. Please find ways to support us in the show notes. Now enjoy this episode. All right, today is December the 13th in 2024, and my guest is JP Vergne. JP is a professor at University College London. His research subjects are technology and the evolution of organizations, including Web3 and DAOs. He's the author of the book, The Pirate Organization: Lessons from the Fringes of Capitalism. JP has quite contrarian views on organizational innovation in Web3, for example, that decentralization is often nothing more than a theater that falls short on its promises. And he has really insightful views on how the influence of piracy in the past and present has shaped has shaped capitalism and has shaped the world we live in. So with that, JP, welcome to the show.
Hi, Niklas, and thanks for having me.
Anything you'd like to add to the intro? Anything else you'd like to tell the listeners about yourself and about your work?
I think I would like to mention that I've been very excited by the developments that have followed the creation of Bitcoin already 15 years ago, and has been a careful student of those developments, trying to adopt the position of a neutral researcher, a neutral scholar, rather than that of a critic or an advocate. And I feel that this position has enabled me to really talk to a broad range of people, and I hope to be able to give kind of a summary of some of the discussions and the research findings that came along over the past few years.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk a bit more why you do what you do, what impact you hope it has, and what are kind of the things you'd like people to take away from your work?
Yeah, so my fundamental interest and the fundamental question that I'm trying to answer is what is capitalism and how does it evolve? And the intuition that I've been working on for many years now is the idea that there's an endogenous evolutionary engine within capitalism that enables its evolution in ways that are partly predictable, and that at the core of this evolution engine, we find what I call, with my co-author Rodolphe Durand, pirate organizations. So organized groups of people who operate from the fringes of capitalism, from the fringes of what has been codified, what has been normalized using legal frameworks. And that space for experimentation is actually an important space to observe if we want to be able to tell what will happen next.
Yeah, fantastic. This is such a really novel way to approach the topic, and also highly topical with modern technology and the kind of things that we see in the world today, and how we've seen internet culture reshape things, and now Web3 and crypto. So you've been visiting us in Vitalia at the last Crypto City Summit. You gave a talk that was a really true highlight and that I really, really loved. What was the experience like coming to Vitalia, and in what ways is it a pirate organization?
Yeah, I felt, the term you used is resonating with me and with the studies that I've done in the past. I think that what is happening in Vitalia is fundamentally an act of organizing a pirate community, in the sense that it's enabling experimentation with new technologies, with new forms of organizing that would not necessarily be allowed or productive to conduct within traditional nation states as they exist today. And in that sense, Vitalia City is very much evocative of communities, piratical communities of the past, like we have seen in the 17th century, in pretty much the same area of the world, by the way, in the Caribbean, broadly speaking, but also elsewhere, where we observed for the first time back then the first decentralized forms of governance, where we had pirate crews, for instance, using tools of democratic governance to determine the distribution of rewards, and under certain circumstances that help them become more effective than their competitors. And so this experimentation took place within an institutional setup, or at the periphery of an institutional setup, very much in the same way that Vitalia City is operating today.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk a bit more about that maybe towards the end, what lessons or how we can think about governance, right? So, and also for listeners, so Vitalia is a bit kind of, we don't propose like a specific governance innovation with Vitalia itself, right? But we're taking place within Próspera. And I think Próspera, the developer of the city and kind of the jurisdiction that has the special economic zones, has a very core governance innovation. And we kind of see ourselves as a big part of that project or building on top of that. And we can talk more about that later. There's a lot to be said about that. But let's first get some of your ideas out. So let's talk about the role of pirates in the evolution of governance. Why did you write the book in the first place? What did you feel was misunderstood, or what drove you to that insight that this kind of organization really has this dynamic effect or force on capitalism?
I think the driver was twofold. I noticed a profound misunderstanding around what capitalism is, and a profound misunderstanding around what piracy is. And the book was really an attempt to address those two misunderstandings at the same time, and showing how those two notions actually are related, and how they shape the evolution of our economies and our societies for centuries already. The fundamental misunderstanding around capitalism stems from its association with free markets, and to the extent that we have people either from the anarchist side or the libertarian side who believe that a perfect capitalist society is one where there would be no government, no state, and all the markets would be naturally in a free natural state of existence. I think that's a profound misunderstanding of what capitalism is and how it's come to exist to begin with. And in fact, just looking at a very empirical level, it's very hard to come up with one single example in history of a successful economy that was run without a state. There's no such example. There's been many attempts, but that has never really worked out at scale in the long run. The second misunderstanding is what is piracy? And I think piracy is a common notion because it's become popular in movies, in stories that we tell children, and later on that we show to adults in Hollywood. But the idea that piracy is just a bunch of criminals who are operating on the seas on board a ship. So they're just like, maybe like bank robbers, but instead of robbing banks, they rob other ships. I think is a very limited understanding of piracy. It's a much broader notion. And I think intuitively we all know it without necessarily being able to explain why. But we know that when we talk about pirates on the internet, or when we talk about biopirates, or when we talk about pirate radio, we know that there's a reason why we use the same term that we used to talk about the pirates on the oceans from the 17th century without necessarily being able to explain why. The book was trying to explain why that intuition that we have in common day language actually reveals something profound about the nature of innovation coming from the fringes of capitalist economies.
Yeah, that's very interesting that we have this intuitive understanding that we use the term kind of correctly in this continuation. So can you help us a bit enrich our understanding of what the historical piracy that we have, the pictures in our mind of like a Captain Jack Sparrow or whatever, what it was actually like, and how it influenced basically the institutional setup and capitalism then?
So the relationship between pirates and capitalism is really it boils down to how pirates interact with the nation state after the nation state acquires sovereignty at the beginning of the 17th century, and that happens for the first time in Europe. The notion of state sovereignty is fundamental because it's the moment in history where we leave the Middle Ages and the feudal organization of the Middle Ages to recognize the existence of large territories where one central set of norms, regulations, laws applies equally on that territory. In feudal times, you could look at any country in Europe and you would observe that every town has its own currency, every town has its own set units of measures, of weight, of distance, etc., its own regulations. For each profession, you would find a guild that would have its own rituals for who gets to have the job, who gets promoted, how much they get paid, etc., which made the scaling up of any business initiative incredibly difficult because there was no uniform, homogeneous surface on which you could conduct economic exchange at scale. That becomes possible with the birth of sovereignty, because now you have one central sovereign that says all of those local rules, all of those local currencies, units of measures, trade codes, they all disappear. And we're going to propose that on this territory that forms the territory of the nation state, there is one sovereign code that everyone must respect. So there is, in a way, a monopoly on the production of rules. And that is very much what sovereignty is about. And that enables business to flourish in many ways by providing a large, smooth surface on which exchanges can be conducted. Now, the problem with that is it's great to grow business, but it's not very great to promote innovation in many contexts because we are now bound by a uniformity of rules, and certain kinds of innovation, they require a different set of rules to emerge, not just a different set of technologies, not just a different set of people, but a different set of rules. And that is when piracy actually plays a fundamental role by offering ways to contest sovereignty, to contest the centralization of rulemaking. Welcome back.
About that.
Yeah, so I suspected that's what was happening. So I pretended that everything was good and I finished my answer. And then I made a pause. Good. So hopefully you'll be able to edit out the part where you're gone without us having to repeat the previous interaction.
Good. Where did you end it?
I finished explaining that the relationship between piracy and sovereignty, and how sovereignty is great for growing businesses, but it's not great for innovation because sometimes innovation requires a different set of rules. And this is when pirates enter in some kind of conflict with the sovereign who insists on having one centralized set of rules.
Anyway, so seems to be working now. So where did you end the answer to the question?
Yeah, so I ended by saying that pirates, to come up with some innovations, they need a different framework of rules, and for that they need to contest sovereignty.
So can you give some examples where pirates tested sovereignty, and also, if I'm not misunderstanding you, pirates developed also their own economies and their own governance, right? They had a business model, if you will, right?
That's right. There's external innovations that are promoted by pirates, new products, new services, new ways of operating with competitors or with partners. But there's also internal innovation in how they are organized, how they govern their own organizations. I think the original example that I think most people can identify with, because it's familiar, is the original pirates on the oceans. Right after this notion of sovereignty was started to become prominent and accepted worldwide in the 17th century as a way to build states. The pirates were a new form of competition. And what's very important to understand is that around that time, there was a lot of competition in international trade. But the problem is that all the competitors were, in a way, identical. They were all trying to do the same thing. So every European country was creating a trading company with monopoly rights. And each trading company from the Netherlands, from the UK, from France, from Sweden, from Denmark, etc., they were all trying to claim ownership rights on the trading routes that they were using on the ocean. So they were trying to privately appropriate portions of the high seas and the oceans. So lots of competition, but they were all trying to do the same thing. So there was not a lot of diversity in terms of the rules that people wanted to play by. Pirate crews were the ones that did not accept that trading routes could be appropriated by private companies backed by their respective nation states. What they wanted is to have more free trade by having these trading routes be used as a common good to be shared by other merchants. And so that idea at the time was very, very much a revolutionary idea, and it really implied that the rules had to be changed. It took about 250 years for those rules to be changed. There was a convention in the 1850s that finally recognized that the sea routes could not be appropriated. And that is when piracy on the oceans, as we had known it for 250 years, stopped. Because there was no conflict anymore between the sovereign nations and their monopolies and the pirates, because now it was recognized that the sea routes could not be appropriated anymore. That story happened 100 years later when the ancestor of the internet was created. And there was a question of, can we appropriate cyberspace and how?
It's interesting. I mean, in one sense, the pirates are then the true capitalists, right? Or maybe what was the conflict about ownership about, right? So because like ownership in private property is kind of central to capitalism, but there's also like, how do we appropriate property, right? So it's not cool if you appropriate something that you don't use, for example, if you follow a law, right? So you should make productive use of it and things like that. So do you see some kind of the arguments of capitalism unfolding and kind of that, or maybe you can share a bit more ideas on that?
Yeah, I think the true capitalists in the story are everyone, all the players involved in the sense. I think capitalism, if you look at the pivotal moments where it really opens up into new markets, new industries, new territories, always involves three players that are interacting in ways that are particularly interesting. The nation state with sovereign principle applied, monopolies that are used by the nation states to actually propose centralized rulemaking into a new industry, whether it's international trade or the internet in the early days, or the early days of radio broadcasting. And then those that are considered pirates, which are organized groups of innovators who do not accept the rules that are proposed by the states, and that they are called pirates by those states. Often they are criminalized and they are fought. And so they enter into this conflictual relationship. But I think the capitalist engine really is the result of this interaction between those three parties. And there's not one of those three that is more or less capitalist than the other, in my view. I think it's really about the interaction, this triangle of interaction that sets the evolution of capitalism and helps it move from one era to the next era of territorial expansion and market expansion.
Yeah, I mean, that is in a very interesting way challenging some of my thinking, right? Because in that universe, I'm certainly the pirate, right? So, because I think there's many of these governments or monopolies, they shouldn't have that monopoly on, well, this thing, for example, like how to make like regulations and things like that, right? So, but I'm kind of seeing myself as the true capitalist and the state more as like trying to prevent capitalism. So that's kind of an interesting challenge to me, right? So I'm trying to see, okay, where do we actually need the state to provide these things? Like to me, what is the problematic thing is that they sort of embarize their current state, right? So this is kind of what we own. So even regardless of what size we've grown to, but it's kind of not okay because it gets inefficient, and you're preventing others from providing better alternatives to what you're offering. But that interplay is the part of it that's kind of a very challenging or interesting idea.
Yeah, I see why there is a tension, and this tension is actually very natural. I think it's present in any industry that you will look at, especially in its early days. But I think it's also something that we need to become comfortable with this tension. There hasn't been a successful capitalist society without the state. I think we just need to, look at history and admit that it's not happened, we not because capitalism has been wrong or because we never really managed to implement it as it should. It's the same argument that's used by people who are defending communism today and say, well, yeah, the communist states, they have not succeeded, but that's because we didn't really implement the real communism, right? But it will happen in one day. At some point, we need to look back at history and say, well, maybe there's a reason why it didn't happen. Is that because capitalism actually, as we know it, needs a state? And if you have something that doesn't have a state, it's not going to be capitalism. It's going to be something very, very different. But what all the capitalist societies have in common, though, is that they are oriented towards production. They are productivist societies. They have different ways to get there, but production means that you are combining flows of labor and flows of capital, right? And you're combining those flows in productive ways. And for that to happen in a productive fashion, you need to have, to some extent, the collapsing of previous codes that used to regulate society. And so capitalism developed itself in the 17th century against the church, against religious authorities, against city-states that were trying to create these independent, autonomous zones with their own rules, and also against the nobility and the aristocracy inherited from the Middle Ages and the feudal societies. Capitalism had to crush those three sets of codes to come to existence through this notion of sovereignty.
Yeah, let's dig a bit deeper because my challenge to that argument would be three different things. One is, can't we say that the periods where the state was kind of smallest or least involved were the most successful periods of capitalism, right? So thinking kind of early Hong Kong, thinking of like the 19th century Britain for a very brief period of time, similar Germany, the Wirtschaftswunder. So there's like often very specific periods where just a lot progress is possible. Then sort of the state becomes stronger, and then much of the capitalist forces of production get weaker than they otherwise could be. The second challenge is, so if you break the state down to its individual components, what everyone agrees they should be providing, even if you're like very libertarians, like policing, law, and national defense, there's individual examples for each of these things being provided without the state in history. Not in total, but in the individual components. And then the third is, so is it true that city-states weren't like competitors or offering a good product within sort of a capitalist economy? So thinking, for example, of the Hanseatic League, which wasn't like formally sovereign, but they did form strong associations with many mutual rules that enabled trade, right?
Yeah, no, those are great points. So I think that if you look at the 19th century, where you had a lot of capitalistic patterns for sure, and a state that was not as large or present across sectors than it is today, you will see societies that were essentially extractive societies, right? So you'd be looking at the essentially capitalist economies that were not sustainable over the long run, and the ones that actually implemented state reform earlier were able to survive crises and become more resilient to crises. And this is something we've seen with the New Deal under Roosevelt in the U.S., for instance. In fact, the states that were able to provide rulemaking to guarantee better conditions for labor, for instance, were also able to recombine labor and capital in more productive ways over the long term. So there is a more sustainable aspect to the capitalism as we know it today, where the state has gained a more prominent presence. Now, your second point is not really about the rulemaking, it's about ownership structure. State-owned versus private-owned. I think that is a separate problem in many ways. And I don't think capitalism as a mode of organizing productive relationships mandates either state ownership or private ownership or a particular balance between the two. I think this is actually part of the evolution of capitalism, and we see changes happening across industries and over time. There are choices that are made as well. In certain contexts, most productive arrangement might be state ownership. In others, it may be private ownership. But I don't think one is more capitalist than the other. And I think when we go in the space of cutting edge innovation in the blockchain sector, for instance, we see that the most advanced innovations rely on public networks, right? So they are not state owned, but they are not privately owned either. And that part is, so who owns the infrastructure, whether we're talking about the roads or the blockchains, is not a question that will determine whether we're looking at something that is capitalist or not. And so I would separate the question of having a state that is involved in centralized rulemaking from the question of whether the state owns or not the businesses or the infrastructures. I think these two things can exist in a capitalist economy.
But you're saying that the status rulemaking is to some degree necessary?
I think it is necessary to have productive relationships that can scale. If you have different rules for exchange, for trade, for currency patterns, for regulations, for labor utilization, capital utilization in each town, you can see how it's going to become a disadvantage for a business, an organization to expand in a territory that doesn't have this centralized rulemaking, at least to some extent, for the things that matter to their business. Now, it doesn't mean you cannot have business. It doesn't mean you can have private enterprise or even profitable private enterprise. It only means that relative to other territories that have decentralized rulemaking and are able to create a smooth, homogeneous territory for productive relationships, you may be at a disadvantage. And I think over time, what we have seen is that the relative advantage of the sovereign nation state has played out and has become the dominant model for a period of several centuries because it has worked very, very well. Now, it doesn't mean it will always be the most suitable model. We could come to a time, because of social evolution, technological evolution, where a different model is possible and becomes relatively more competitive. If that happens, and I think it could happen, I think we would probably need to say, well, capitalism is over and we're entering a new age and we would need a new term for that. Just like we needed a new term when we left feudalism and entered a new kind of society around 1600.
Yeah. My own views on that is I think it's actually quite easy to conceive that it can be non-state actors who provide laws and who provide policing and private security. The one thing where things fall apart and where you need a state is for national defense in an area where you need where there's an imbalance between the payoff to centralized versus decentralized means of defense. So in other words, China needed a Great Wall and be very centralized to be able to defend, right? Versus for like the small and feudal and European nations, they were kind of easier to invade in that way. Although it's not necessarily always the case, right? Because if you have like small handguns and weapons technology and guerrilla warfare and things like that, you become actually harder to invade when you're decentralized, right? So it's kind of the relative provision of national security goods, depending on what the current technology is, that requires a more or less centralized or a larger or smaller state, right? And then once you have that, and once that state has this monopoly on violence, they will also go into rulemaking, right? Because there's lots of payoffs from that. Like they want these monopolies basically to make them money, right? In that state, they kind of become unavoidable. And any reaction to that idea? Or
Yeah, no, I think the defense sector is a fundamentally important industry to look at when we study capitalism. In fact, what you say is historically significant since the very beginning of capitalism, because before the origin of capitalism, that I like to pinpoint around the same time the notion of sovereignty was implemented, we did not have permanent armies. The norm was to have private groups of mercenaries that kings had to pay when they wanted to wage a war against a nearby town, province, or kingdom. Right? There was no such thing as a permanent army. And what was a big change in the 17th century was that with the nation state's ability to fight back against aristocracy, city-states, and religious authorities, they were able to implement sovereign territories with homogeneous rules that allowed for taxation in a way that was workable, actionable. And taxation at scale enabled private armies to become state armies, permanent armies. You need a lot of taxes to be able to pay loyal armies and to have them work for you permanently. So since that the dawn of capitalism and state sovereignty, we've had permanent armies. There's been a few exceptions. We've seen a period of time about 20 years ago in the US where we had private mercenary groups that were used. Blackwater was a very famous one at the time, but that was a temporary period of a few years. There has been changes in the regulations since then. We've seen more recently Russia use heavily private armies for reasons that probably are off topic for today. And we see that in other countries. Often we see that in what I would call failed states. And there's a reason. They're not, the states themselves are not failed, but their sovereignty is failed. And so they have to revert back to the strategies for national defense that predate capitalism, and that's private armies.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating discussion. Maybe it's for listeners clear that many of these questions are, so open-ended, like they can't change and they are evolving. And there's rather these tensions that many of these new forms of organizations are coming from, rather than there being sort of this one model or end state, be it capitalism, be it democracy, be it sovereignty, statehood, whatever. These are all categories that are in flux and that are redefined and are changing shape, as has happened so many times in history. So with that, let's move to the modern era. So what are kind of the forms of organizations where you see pirates today, or the different areas in technology that stand out to you?
If we look at the internet, it's the rise of the internet has been marked by a series of monopolies by private firms that were significantly tied to the one sovereign nation state involved in the development of the internet as a technology, which is the United States. Initially developed a communication network for military purposes. It was called the ARPANET. After the Second World War, it became the internet later on, and then it was spawned into a completely different use technology. But rules needed to be created to adjudicate disputes, on this new territory, who can trade there, on what conditions, who is allowed to have access, why, how, by providing what kind of credentials, etc. And so at first, the company that was ruling the internet before it became the web in the around 1990 was AT&T. It was a large telecommunications monopoly in the US. It still exists today under different forms, but AT&T was a massive player throughout the 70s and 80s in the United States. And it basically controlled the early infrastructure of the internet. And that monopoly was contested by the first generation of hackers, internet pirates before the invention of the web. And these groups were very organized, and they were basically advocating for the infrastructure of the internet to be considered a common good as opposed to a monopolized good monopolized by AT&T with the blessing of the US government. And they fought very hard for 20 years. One of the most famous of those hackers was Steve Jobs. Before he started companies, he was a student on university campuses in California, and he actually had created a hacking device called the Blue Box that he was selling to other students. And the purpose of the Blue Box was to help connect to the AT&T infrastructure, the cables, so you could actually phone long distance without having to pay the monopoly fees to AT&T. So it was a pirate strategy and a pirate tool that Steve Jobs was selling before he started companies that themselves, in some ways, became quite monopolistic in some niche segments. What we observed after that is other companies taking a big role after AT&T was deemed to be too monopolistic and was kind of punished. We've seen the role of Microsoft that was fundamental in the 90s, and perhaps more recently, and even more obviously, the role of Google that was let by the US government for many years operate, grow as a monopoly, de facto monopoly on US cyberspace, and in many ways on global cyberspace, until very recently, in the last few weeks, the US government decided to pull the plug and suddenly declared that all the money that Google made in the prior 20 years was essentially illegal rents from a monopoly. And so, but the influence of Google is fundamental because it allowed the US government to keep control over the way the cyberspace is structured as a new territory for capitalist exchange. And we see that China has been doing something very similar within its digital firewall by having monopolies, tech monopolies, control the rules, set the rules in a centralized fashion. And that really serves the purpose of sovereign nation states in the competition that opposes nation states with each other.
Yeah. And would you agree or expand on the idea that states want, and that's what you originally said, they want to create these monopolies? Like that is how they make rent or money, right? So, and the funny thing is that they actually do it in the guise of preventing monopolies, which is really the history of antitrust, right?
Absolutely. I think antitrust is a very interesting area at the intersection of the law, politics, business, and economics. It is always presented as a very strong constraint imposed by the rule of law on business making, but the reality is that it's often eminently a political issue, and that whenever a state, however powerful it is, however democratic it is, finds it more convenient for their interests to let a homegrown monopoly control an entire new industry, it will let that happen until it becomes no longer their interest. And then it will use antitrust law to blow the whistle and say, okay, time is up, game is over, you've made your money, but now we need to move on to something else because it's no longer aligned with the sovereign interests of the state. And we've seen that same pattern happen over and over again. The entire history, the early days of radio broadcasting is exactly that, with states using monopolies to control the rulemaking. That's the history of the BBC. That was a monopoly in radio broadcasting in the UK between the 1920s until 1967. That is something we have observed on the internet. That is something we may observe in the next few years when we have space conquest, where we start producing capitalistic, productive exchange outside of the boundaries of planet Earth, whether it is on the moon, on Mars, or on asteroids, where there's a lot of stuff that can be mined, and that's very valuable, diamonds, for instance. We will see that there will be a similar tension, and there will be state monopolies that are sometimes state-owned, sometimes privately owned, but they are monopolies that are let by certain states operate because it is what they do is align with the interest of the state. And sometimes being the person that being the entity that sets the rules for everyone else is a lot more valuable than being the business operator.
Yeah. I would even go a step further and say it's the state actually that creates the monopoly, right? In fact, there's very few, if any, examples where private companies without state intervention have sustained monopolies over long periods of time, right? So there's this very big myth about Standard Oil as something that had to be broken up, but they actually declined being a monopoly already way before the state intervened. It was actually as a result of much of antitrust legislation, state intervention, that we had monopolies. So if you look at the monopolies that currently exist, right? So, and I think, just because there's a lot of rent to capture. I had this very interesting conversation with Sam Peltzman on this podcast, who studied regulation for 50 plus years, who's like, okay, once you're big enough, then you're an attractive target for the state, right? Because that's how they get much of their revenue, from these large monopolies.
Absolutely, and I think the Standard Oil example is fundamental to understand the history of antitrust, because it's around the time where the first powerful antitrust regulations were promulgated and implemented, and they really shaped the history of antitrust. I think if we wanted to push the thinking we're doing here, the brainstorming one step further into unknown territory, we could even mention the arguments that are made by some economists and some political economists that property is the ultimate form of monopoly. And that's an argument that was made by Eric Posner and Glenn Weil in a paper that they published a few years ago, where they actually show that property rights are monopolistic rights, and that under certain circumstances, this form of monopoly right that we call property is not the most productive way to use an asset. And that seems very shocking to people maybe who are used to old school separation between left wing and right wing when it comes to thinking about the economy and property and liberalization, privatization, and things like that. But I think for economists, for social scientists, this is actually a notion that really has merit and needs to be looked at very seriously. When you think about innovations that we will discuss in the next few minutes, I'm sure, such as public permissionless blockchain networks, it is very hard to actually say, is this like a new form of private property that's being created, or is this a new form of public crowd-funded common good that we are looking at? And when you look at communities of people around blockchain, around Ethereum, around Bitcoin, you will find people who are eminently libertarian, who are attracted to these new networks, because what they see here is non-state private property. But you will also find anarchists, and anarchists were very present in the early days among the cypherpunks. So it's a group of hackers that developed some of the technological building blocks that we find today behind Bitcoin. And the anarchist view is similar to the libertarian view, with one major difference. The anarchists are also opposing the notion of property. Mm-hmm. They are against the state, like the libertarians, but they're also against property. And you find anarchists that are fascinated by Bitcoin and by Ethereum, because what they see there is that we can do without the state, maybe, but we can also do without property. And so, is Bitcoin inherently communist or capitalist or libertarian? It's a question that is very hard to answer.
Yeah, but I think that's also the real tension that I think is actually the more productive one, rather than between the state and like the private, because this tension doesn't require the state, right? So there are people who produce common and public goods on their own, like without requiring violence, the state, or whatever, in open competition with others that's saying, hey, I want to appropriate some part of this for profit, versus others are saying, okay, it's fine that you do that, but we need to create an enabling environment and common and public goods for that, right? So I think that's like the real tension, and that shows that is actually the more productive one, right? Because it shows, because after all, these goods are publicly provided by private individuals who don't have special authority over others. They can disagree and say, hey, whatever, but they can't like use violence to prevent you from doing it your way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the fundamental task of the contemporary nation states is to organize around this and deal with that tension that you are describing, where there is today, through increased education of people and increased availability of technological tools through digital networks, there is more innovation happening than the state can actually deal with, right? So there's an intentional constraint, which is like the state can't deal with all these things at the same time. There's too much happening, so it has to prioritize, has to decide what is the kind of innovation there that we need to look at in priority, because it has the potential to be productive, to be aligned with our interests, to be aligned with what we want to do. And then what is the best way to regulate it? What is the best time to regulate it? And I think what we see around across sectors that are as diverse as cryptocurrency, biotech, or AI is that different states prioritize different things. And that sometimes the wait and see approach is a pretty good one. I think sometimes we complain that the state is too slow to provide clarity around a particular new emerging sector, but I think sometimes it's just deliberate. They are not being slow. They are just waiting and seeing because they need more information to assess the potential of that sector. And sometimes they know that waiting and seeing is the best way to encourage experimentation. And I think there's value sometimes to just waiting and seeing. And there's been a lot of that in cryptocurrency. There's been a lot of that in biotech. And I think there's going to be a lot of that in AI as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem in crypto was more that they weren't waiting, right? They were regulating by enforcement instead of clear rules, right?
That's been the approach that we've seen in the US for many years. I think other countries were a lot more silent and a lot less proactive, and maintained a level of ambiguity and silence that encouraged innovation. I remember living in Canada around the time where Ethereum was built and was launched around 2015, 2016. A lot of the initial Ethereum ecosystem was based in Canada, because people were based in Canada, but regulatory moves and signals sent at the time in Canada were not particularly encouraging. Meanwhile, other countries were adopting a wait and see approach that was stated: we will not act until we know more. And in fact, we will make sure no one goes to prison for playing around with new technology. And that led to a lot of these people leaving Canada and setting up their shop somewhere else. At the time, Switzerland was attracting a lot of people. There's been other countries around the time that were also trying to move labor and capital around to create productive relationships on their own, kind of sovereign set of rules. And they were very successful at that. And in many ways, Canada missed their chance. The US also missed their chance in some ways, but they're trying to compensate now in some ways.
Yeah. So this is a fascinating discussion. Let's talk now about kind of the evolution of different forms of organizations. And maybe we can kind of work backwards from your contrarian idea that DAOs are currently not really innovating when it comes to governance?
Yeah. So I do believe there is something new in the world of DAOs. I don't think that's necessarily what people would call DAOs using the acronym DAO. I think a lot of what we see among the projects that call themselves DAOs are, in fact, just replicating a very well-known organizational and governance structure with a digital component added to it. So, for instance, we've had for a very long time now what economists know as club organizations. Club organizations were, hugely popular in London when coffee and tea were becoming a thing, and it was very expensive goods. They were hard to source, and so people would create a club, and they would pay a membership fee to access a place where they could drink coffee. And by joining forces together, they were gaining bargaining power. They were able to source a volume of coffee for their own benefit at a price that was attractive to them. So we see a lot of DAOs today that are essentially crowdfunding a community that is essentially a club. People pay a membership fee, and by that they can enjoy jointly a particular service. It's a club, right? And then a lot of other DAOs would resemble what we typically would call cooperatives. Cooperatives are organizations that are owned by their suppliers or by their users. So a typical cooperative would be a bunch of farmers who have a few cows and they produce milk, but each of them taken independently is too small to actually process the milk and have the actual facility to process the milk. So jointly, these farmers will form a co-op. Each farmer is a member. Each member has one vote, and jointly they will have one facility to process the milk, and they will all send the milk as joint suppliers to the co-op, to the facility, and then they will sell their milk together. And they will adopt these traditional rules for cooperatives: one member, one vote. A lot of DAOs are essentially digital cooperatives where the vote is recorded on a blockchain, but there's nothing fundamentally different in terms of the governance. So I could go on and on. There's a lot of very traditional organizations that are just being replicated under a new moniker, DAO, without a fundamentally new governance mechanism or design. And so I have nothing against that. I just observe it. And I also see that there's a lot of people that are overclaiming innovation when there is not necessarily innovation. With that said, I do believe that there is a fundamental governance innovation that was introduced. And I think that fundamental innovation boils down to a different arrangement in the relationship between those who own and those who control organizations. So if we look at a public corporation, a traditional firm, we have the owners, the shareholders. They own the company. And then we have people who control the company and make the decisions on a daily basis. And those people are called managers. And essentially what shareholders do is that they own the company, but maybe they own multiple companies, or they own multiple sections of multiple companies. They don't have the skill or the competence or the cognitive bandwidth to actually run all those organizations. So what they do is that they delegate that part to professional managers, and they pay them a salary to do that. Sometimes they give them also some equity incentives to make sure that the interests are aligned. But so there is a separation between owners and controllers of organization. That is fundamental. It's like two groups of people. There's a lot of problems that come from this separation, a lot of tensions, a lot of misalignment of incentives that can happen, but that there's a system that overall has been very successful since its creation around the early 17th century. If we look at Bitcoin, what we see is that the owners of the Bitcoin tokens do not vote. if I own a Bitcoin, I don't have a vote. I don't get to vote on the future of Bitcoin. That seems like, that seems like a less good arrangement. Like it seems like something was taken away from me if I compare that to the public corporation that I just described. In fact, it's a blessing. It's a blessing because I can co-own a public network without having to worry about, okay, what should I vote? What's the proposal about? I don't have the competence to understand it. So, do I vote at random, or do I just not use my right to vote? That can be very problematic, right? How does Bitcoin organize this traditional governance design? They actually create a third group of people. There's the owners who own the tokens but don't vote. There's the developers, the core developers that essentially operate the organization, evolve its rules, launch new products, if you wish, new services. But then there's a third group of people. It's a third category of stakeholders that did not exist before any time in history. We've never seen that before in capitalism's history. And those are the validators, what I would call the network validators, so that we understand that they can exist with Bitcoin, but also in any other public blockchain. The network validators, in the case of Bitcoin, they are mining the currency. They actually play a fundamental role because they further separate power, not between just two groups of people, but between three, which further decentralizes decision-making authority in ways that were previously unseen. And that is a fundamental change because it limits the power of the core developers, of the controllers of the organization. It also limits the power of the owners of the network. And it creates a buffer that provides a lot of stability to the organization and enables what I would call platform neutrality.
Yeah,
which is
just
that
so every listener's on the same page, can you describe what the validators are actually doing?
Yeah, so the validators are, without getting too technical, there's several types of validators. People are very familiar or have heard of the miners who play a role in the creation of new currency, among other things, in the Bitcoin network. But there are also equally, if not more important, validators that are the full nodes. And the full nodes are full validating nodes in Bitcoin are not necessarily miners. They can be different people. You can run a full node without being a miner. And the fully validating nodes are actually the ones that are verifying that the rules of the game have been applied adequately as defined jointly by all the stakeholders in the organization. So they are the referees, in a way, that ensure that the game is being played by the players following the rules that they had agreed upon before starting the game. And that is fundamental because that means that the platform is neutral and cannot be easily taken over by one small group of people that could suddenly decide to change the rules and, in a way, rug pull the platform from underneath the feet of the people who have invested in it by developing applications on top of it, complementary services, etc., have invested a lot of time building on top. This kind of decentralization that you see with proof of work public blockchains is actually a fundamental governance innovation. Instead of just owners and operators, you have owners without the right to vote, you have referees, network validators, and then the third group, which is the core developers, who in some ways share some of the roles that the manager would play in a traditional corporation, but minus a few of those.
Yeah, it's a very, very fascinating. And how does that currently play out in like wider Web3? So what do you see kind of as welcome trends that further build on that innovation, and where does a decentralization theater come in?
So the decentralization theater is a term that I've written about, but that others have coined it before me. That refers to the misleading claims that a project is very decentralized when in fact it is not. And so the theater is this idea that you have to always maintain the illusion of decentralization through claim making, through framing a project in particular ways, using particular terminology, when in fact the project is not particularly decentralized in any meaningful way. And I think blockchain has fallen into its own trap by at times not recognizing where the true sources of decentralization lie, and instead emphasizing mechanisms that do not really contribute to decentralization as the real innovation. So, for instance, voting does not really contribute to decentralization in general. And yet it's something that people obsess about, but voting will only contribute to decentralization under very specific circumstances that are often not reunited in Web3. For instance, most Web3 projects, the people who actually have the tokens and the right to vote do not vote because they don't have the skill to do it and they don't have the time to do it. And so it leads to projects that are essentially captured by a very, very small number of players, making them increasingly more centralized over time and in absolute terms more centralized than traditional corporations.
Yeah, we debated some of these questions at the last summit. It was one of my pet peeves that I would have been seeing, and that's been confirmed by much of what you said in your work, is that DAOs often there's a misunderstanding. Like there's larger institutions and structures in society that are too centralized and that we need decentralization for. But if you start decentralization in a small organization, you're often just introducing politics early, right? So, and you're making the organization slow. That's like a very common experience among DAOs, where, there can be millions of small, highly aligned, centralized organizations, right? Especially in the beginning, you want to have focused teams, right? It's really distracting if you would have to start to vote or do politicking, right, around it. So there is already an inbuilt decentralization from this many different organizations doing the same thing. And then there's more the idea of decentralization by design when you're becoming a big organization, which, as you're saying, Bitcoin has in some way perfected, right? Anything to add on that?
I think you're right to say that decentralization is often associated with being slow.
Mm-hmm.
I think we just need to be comfortable with that fact. And then the next thing we should highlight then is that decentralization is not a panacea. It's not the solution to every problem. There are situations where you will want to move very fast, and in that case, you probably don't want to decentralize the governance too much because there is no point.
Yeah, exactly. So there's always trade-offs, and just some things you can't decentralize as much as others, or shouldn't be. Like when you build a building or something like that, or where you coordinate very large amounts of efforts that require highly specialized knowledge, right? So fantastic. And do you see any kind of dangers or risks out of premature decentralization that is happening right now, that you'd like listeners that are considering what form of organization to choose? Because DAOs are in other ways attractive. For example, the ability that you can issue a token and it's sort of less, uncertainty around the regulations or whatever. There is still some, but what do you see kind of as the risks of that you would warn against?
Yeah, I think there are several. I will maybe pick one example that I sometimes find a bit concerning, and that's the segment in the industry that often refers to itself as DeSci, decentralized science. And I think there's a great project in that space, but there's also I think a fundamental misunderstanding about what is the problem to begin with that needs to be solved. If we need such a thing as decentralized science, DeSci, then it must be that science is too centralized. But when we look at science and being working in the science profession myself, it's a sector I know very well. When you look at science and people who perform scientific research, they are actually, if you only look at the institutional side of it, you have 20,000 universities in the world. Unless I am mistaken, that's more than there are full nodes in the Bitcoin network, which probably is around 12,000. Then there are scientists also that are independent, and you have scientists that are working for corporations. So you can add a few thousands of nodes in the science network. And then you have people who are funding this research, and that's thousands of government agencies across 200 countries, plus thousands of private corporations and foundations that are funding science on top of that. If anything, science is not centralized at all. It's more decentralized than the most decentralized public permissionless blockchain that is in existence today. And so it's not clear to me what exactly is the problem that needs to be solved with decentralized science. So that's a question mark that I will put on the table. And then when I look at some of the projects in decentralized science, it is obvious to me that the decision-making is concentrated in just a few hands. And so I don't know that there's a problem to be solved with in the first place. And I don't know that there's a solution that's actually being proposed. And so that's, I think, one example of potentially the decentralization theater being laid out for people to view and enjoy without necessarily having a clear purpose. And I think it could, in fact, backfire and damage the traditional structures of science, where we have, biotech startups that are centralized organizations that are developing a new treatment, a new drug, a new molecule, and they're spending maybe 12 years working on that with a very small team, ultimately being successful. Not all of this system has to be just, trashed because of some presumption that it's too centralized. It actually is a system that has delivered a lot of benefits to society. It is not perfect. It can be improved, but I think we need to be careful with all-encompassing claims that this and that is centralized, that needs to be, thrown out with the baby and the bathwater.
Yeah, many of my listeners are in DeSci, and that's definitely something very important for them to think about. Like, I've been saying some of these things as well, and have been a bit critical of some of the aspects of DeSci, and also recently has attracted more criticism because it's going a lot into like meme coins, right? So we leave that there. It's a very big discussion, something that will definitely be continued to be having. Also at the next Vitalia pop-up city, I do laud many of the goals and problem statements made by DeSci, right? I think some of these things are really important to solve, like things like tech transfer offices and IP and things like that. And also what I see as the most centralized thing is drug approval regulations, right? So I think that is one aspect of how science is currently done that is too centralized, and that we're providing an alternative for. So in that way, we are decentralizing some of that in a way. But that's a very big topic and debate. Yeah, I mean, we're close to the end of our conversation. So I just really have one final question. What would you say, what forms of organizations or decentralization are overlooked that people should pay more attention to?
I think there are forms of decentralization that are mostly invisible to us because they do not necessarily rely on explicit, formal coordination. And I think there's a lot of emerging forms of organization coming from complex systems that are fundamentally decentralized because of the informality with which decisions are made and with which actors coordinate, cooperate. I think there's like swarm-like forms of organizations that probably deserve more attention. They are hard to study. We see them in many industries. We see them sometimes. We can see glimpses of them on the internet. But like communities that are basically, operating in a very dispersed way across the planet and coming up with similar solutions at the same time to similar problems, and communities that discover each other as they work on the same topics. I think there are a lot of phenomena here that deserve more examination. And I feel that the idea that giving a token to community members every time they have some common interest is not necessarily the one and only solution to the problem of coordination. It can help in very, very various scenarios, but I think it's not necessarily the only way to get the kind of coordination and cooperation benefits that we want to see. May I return the question to you and say, like, ask you, like, what is ultimately imagine that the Vitalia City project that you've been working so hard on for the past few years and steering through good times and more challenging times is successful ultimately. What does success look like for Vitalia City? Is it a bigger place? Is it a place that spawns other similar cities across the world and as part of a big network? Like, is it a place that specializes on one industry and becomes a leading voice in that particular industry in the world? Like, what does success look like for you?
Yeah, thank you for asking the question. I want to set a new standard, right? So I think we want to be able to prove that you can really reduce the complexity of bureaucracy and regulations, and thereby allow science and technology to save people's lives much faster, and thereby allowing us to solve some of the fundamental problems of humanity, such as aging as the biggest one, which would give us tons of time to solve the other things, right? And I think really these standards are the problem, right? So during COVID, that was kind of apparent to me. Almost any government in the world did the same thing, right? Lots of lockdowns and whatever. There was no diversity of approaches. So it seems a bit that frontier has closed in ways which we innovate when it comes to biomedical and to public health. And I kind of want to reopen that frontier, with Vitalia kind of being the first one to set that example. But sort of the core ideas behind it, and sort of, hey, these are the kinds of regulatory standards we develop, through the Próspera legal system, right? Because it's this idea of regulatory flexibility. That's open source. Like, anyone can do that elsewhere, right? And I want, like, other nations, other providers to see, hey, we could do the same thing, right? So if we make this legal change in, I don't know, Dubai or in Japan or whatever, or, I don't know, the United States, then we can get some of these same things, and this way allow also the dispersion of the benefits from better treatments and from better drugs, if that makes sense, right? So I don't have very strong views myself on how we would innovate in governance as Vitalia. I think organizations generally focus too much on innovating when it comes to governance, right? I think Próspera is doing that. Like, that's the one thing they focus on, right? To be an innovator and do governance differently. We don't have to do it as well, right? And there's no, like, specific idea how a different form of governance would, like, benefit our mission, other than sort of re-advancing the mission itself and kind of showing that the governance innovation we build on is something that can be expanded. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, it does, and that's fascinating to me for two reasons. The first is that it is properly spoken like a true pirate. I think it is a very I recognize a historical pattern here, absolutely, and so I find it very very exciting. And second, I think that what you're trying to do is it's very important. And it creates a very interesting tension, because you are, on the one hand, trying to foster decentralization by offering new approaches to rulemaking in an industry that, despite the competition between states, has a lot of homogeneity in terms of approaches. And by offering this possibility to open source new rules, you are, in a way, enhancing decentralization for the future of an entire industry that's fundamental to humanity. At the same time, the way that you try to achieve this outcome is by creating a platform for people who are like-minded to find each other and to create, in a way, a form of critical mass with a center, which is Vitalia City. And across this network of decentralized, like-minded people, there is, I think, a lot of potential for economies of scale, economies of scope, cross usage of technologies that are developed by different teams. And I think this tension is absolutely fundamental to the project that you are implementing. And I think that it's very promising. So I'm very excited by it. I'm a very, I've been an observer of Vitalia since since it was starting. And you reached out to me some time ago, and I was like, wow, that's fantastic. And it was great for me to have the opportunity to go there and see what you guys are doing. And I will absolutely remain an observer of the developments, and I'm very keen to see what will happen with this incredible project.
Yeah, I'm very happy I reached out to you then. Conversations at the last summit have been very enriching. This conversation as well. Hopefully again in January and February for the next summit in Pop-Up City.
I am thinking about it, and I will be in touch very soon.
Good. And so for any of our listeners, go to vitalia.city. You can sign up for the next Pop-Up City to spend some more time with us and thinking about these questions and building real solutions. JP, is there anything you'd like to give listeners on the way where they can find you, or some parts of your work that you'd like to draw attention to?
Well, they can find more information about my work and read some papers by going to my account on X, which is @pirate.org. And feel free to be in touch.
JP, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Niklas, and have a good break.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us 5 stars in your favorite podcast app and consider subscribing to our Substack. I appreciate your support that makes this show possible. See you in the next one.